Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. And I had a cat on me. I was about to talk about Murakami, and I had a cat sitting on me, and he ran away, which is kind of fitting to Murakami. But I just in thinking about theme and variation as a story structure, which is a fascination of mine, for many reasons. I have a cat making a lot of noise and chaos down there, and that's kind of fitting Murakami. Are you done? Um, just thinking about theme and variation and the whole notion of originality. The false notion of originality as this universal good and this very dualistic sort of perspective on how stories work. You consider a lot of highly respected. Let's see if I can get this cat, which is kind of the plot of a lot of Murakami books. A lot of really respected writers are highly formulaic. Murakami being one, Pynchon being another. Um, if you read one Pynchon book, you kind of have read them all. In a way, the actual overall structure of the book is ultimately irrelevant. Just the quality of the book, just the enjoyment of the book. If you've read one Murakami book, you've kind of read all of them. The formulaic similarity of each book, similarity of each book is ultimately irrelevant to whether or not the book is good. But if you said, is Murakami and is Pynchon formulaic? Yeah, definitely. But then also there's another really famous formulaic author, and I just happened to binge a lot of movie adaptations of Ian Fleming's work over the break. Don't know what the cat is doing. In this world beyond my vision, I don't know what this cat is doing, but she's making a lot of destructive sounding noises. Bo? Are you destroying things? No, okay. So, and I became fascinated with that particular formula. And I think a lot, part of the fascination of the theme and variation is to try to figure out how much of it needs to be new. You hear cat noises just off screen. This is turning into a total Murakami story. Bo! Hush. You wanna just come sit on my lap? Just come sit on my lap. But anyway, kind of the idea, and this is how a lot of the dissemination of essential concepts of storytelling work is to say, what is the essential balance that you need to strike between originality and novelty? If you're following a formula, and formula is not a universal bad. You could be a great writer like Murakami or Pynchon, and all of your stories can kind of follow the same pattern. How much of your story needs to be new in order for it to be stimulating? How much of it needs to be familiar in order for it to be stimulating? Just the familiarity has sort of a secondary stimulation in its familiarity itself. You can reach a degree of comfort where it's no longer stimulating. But something being familiar will have a nostalgic stimulation. Have that sort of secondary stimulation. Just being purely novel, you can short circuit the reader's ability to be stimulated by it. And that's sort of what I was getting at in my last video about the Half-Blood Prince. It follows a formula, but each of the Harry Potter books follow a formula, but each of the books adds something significantly different so that it feels new. It feels new enough, but it also feels familiar enough where it's this comforting level. Each of the Harry Potter books is very comforting, and I think a lot of people who are big fans of, a lot of adults who are big fans, that's the sort of stimulation they would identify as being really significant about that is the comfort of it. And there's something kind of comforting about the James Bond movies. I've never really loved James Bond as a character, but it's a sort of movie you could just put on and it has this comforting sort of stimulation. which is ironic because it's here finally we have a cat. The mystery is solved. But it's a comforting sort of stimulation. You just put them on, and it's it's just bright lights, bright colors, things blowing up, people being shot all over the place. So it's kind of weird to call that comforting, but it really is very comforting in its familiarity. You know what to expect with each of the Bond movies, but you can kind of track it. I watched a bunch of ranking videos, but you can kind of track it from movie to movie where they'll get sillier and sillier and sillier until they're just way too silly. And then the next one will be a very serious one. I really started with the Timothy Dalton ones, and that was kind of in the 80s. And that was kind of a turn to the serious side. And so the whole formula still stays the same, and little elements will be a bit different. Okay. Little elements will be a bit different here and there, like the villain or the henchman will have something really quirky about them. So if you have like a really quirky villain and you follow that with a less quirky villain, this is kind of the Half-Blood Prince issue I was just talking about. If you have, if you look at the whole sequence of 25 or whatever James Bond movies, if you have a really quirky villain and then you follow that with a less quirky villain, by direct contrast, it will stand out as being kind of boring. Like, Slughorn, Slughorn's not a villain, but just, as a dark arts teacher, that's the unique element that J.K. Rowling adds each time. That'll stand out as being, somewhat boring as compared to, if you follow Jaws with some, real bland villain, it'll stand out as, the villain will stand out as being, you follow Oddjob with somebody who's kind of bland, they'll stand out more as being bland. Whereas if you start off with a relatively bland sort of, variation element, you have the theme, but you have the variation. You start off with a relatively bland variation element, and you ramp up on the quirkiness, just whatever sort of factor you're changing, it will increasingly ramp up the stimulation. And sometimes you just have to clean the slate and start over. Just if you look at the span of those 25 stories. But Pynchon and Murakami will do that on a very, very micro scale. So, every Pynchon book, maybe not every Pynchon book, most Pynchon books, it'll be, a character has a mystery that he or she is trying to solve. It'll be some goal that they're trying to get. Very, very basic sort of storyline. If you think of Pynchon as a storyline, there's really not that much to the storyline. But what he'll do is he'll fill the moment by moment with something just really unexpected and strange and quirky. So he'll ratchet that down. So if you think about, the element that gives James Bond's story novelty is, Jaws or Oddjob or a character like that. Pynchon will do that every single scene. Every single scene will be a Jaws type of character. Every single scene will be an Oddjob type of character. Somebody with just some real weird, quirky thing about him. And so he just packs all of that, just scene after scene. And ultimately, the mystery, spoiler alert for Pynchon novels, the mystery tends to be irrelevant. That's kind of how Murakami does it, too, where, there'll be some mystery. Spoiler alert, usually the actual solution to the mystery tends to be irrelevant. And then the main character in just most Murakami novels is basically the same main character. He doesn't really change names all that much. He doesn't change personalities all that much, even if he changes names. I tend to compare Murakami to David Lynch, because David Lynch, the way you really get a good handle on David Lynch is you don't look at the story as a whole. David Lynch, I don't think is really all that interested in the story as a whole. Like Inland Empire, I might have mentioned before, is my favorite movie. But you don't look at Inland Empire necessarily and say, I love Inland Empire because the story of, this particular cohesive story is so compelling. You don't read a Pynchon book and you say, well, that the mystery was so gripping, if another formulaic writer that I love, Agatha Christie. You would certainly say, she does that kind of thing where each of these, she gives you a dozen characters, and each of the characters is really compelling, but it all leads to somewhere. She ties it all up, for sure. Mostly. Pynchon's really not interested in that, but he takes that sort of quirky element. He takes the he takes the Remus Lupin and the Gilderoy Lockhart and the all of these sort of quirky elements that are novel each time he repeats the formula, just jams them all together, and you have 100 of those, and that's kind of his formula. Whereas Murakami is sort of like David Lynch in that way, in that he builds he builds scenes. He doesn't really build a full plot. The kind of plot is kind of always the same. Two parallel worlds. I mean, so many of his books, not all of them, but so many of his books, you have two parallel worlds. You have somebody trying to figure out a mystery of these two parallel worlds. What's the solution? It doesn't really matter. But he builds, on that, he builds all these little beautiful scenes. But then, I mean, it's also one thing that I always argue about, a piece of fiction. There you go, piece of fiction. Is that ultimately liking them is maybe it's irrelevant. Understanding how they work, that's kind of the key. But whether or not you like them is ultimately irrelevant. It's all irrational. Recognize what you like about them on the one hand, but recognize how they work on the other hand. It's just irrational responses to entirely irrational stimuli. Because I can't really say I've ever really loved a full Pynchon book. I can't really say I've ever really loved a full Murakami book. My Murakami's in here. I got rid of all my Pynchon books, but my Murakami it's right there somewhere up there. Still have my Murakami. I might get rid of them one of these days, but can't really say that I truly love the Pynchon and the Murakami. But that's kind of the fascinating thing about the Bond movies, is that on the character level, I've never really liked James Bond as a character. He's very, very cold and just not all that interesting to me. But there's so many of those irrational things that are just right up my alley. So the songs, the Live or Let Die, amazing song. And then he has these really, the credit sequences are these long, elaborate, highly abstract, very complicated, surreal sort of sequences. And so, I mean, I think that's one of the really appealing things about those movies, is the bombast and all that sort of stuff. And I think they kind of work because Bond is so cold. It's super melodramatic. Everything's super melodramatic. I love melodramatic things. I have no problem with melodramatic things. But in an entirely personal level, on an entirely irrational level, of all of those things that I talked about, probably the Bond songs and the Bond opening sequences and a lot of that, highly colorful, highly melodramatic stuff, I prefer that. An entirely personal level, has really nothing to do with expert craftsmanship or anything like that. But on Murakami, as a whole, I've never really loved his books, but I do love scene by scene. I'll have just various scenes that I love, and Pynchon as a whole, I don't really find his books all that interesting. The ones that I finished, a lot of them, I mean, that's kind of the thing with Pynchon. You read a little bit of it and you say, I mean, for me at least, you read a little bit and you say, I kind of get what it is. I don't really feel compelled to read the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, little scenes will be good. I was told that I was influenced by Pynchon, and I decided to get rid of all my Pynchon books, because I definitely was not influenced by Pynchon. That's an irrational response on my part, but I don't always function rationally on those sorts of things. But anyway, I'm writing a story. That's the other thing I want to talk about. I'm writing a story where I sort of accidentally. Well, I'm writing a story where I'm going to try to riff on the Pynchon formula, because it's based on a prompt, and in the conversation we talked about Pynchon, so I'm going to be riffing on the Pynchon formula. It's called Colors Nobody Bothered to Name. So the whole idea is that there's a color that doesn't have a name in the Pantone guide, so this guy sort of goes on a quest to figure that out. He kind of wants there to be a murder involved, and so he's sort of rationalizing that there must have been a murder involved and nobody naming this color in the Pantone system. But I sort of accidentally slipped into a Murakami story where it's a story called Music Activated Meat, where this guy's, and I sort of brought it on myself because it's a mystery involving a guy fixating on cats. So I should have seen the Murakami plot just coming from a mile away. But the idea was that this guy, is watching someone who owns the store who keeps taking in these cats, and he's got to figure out what's happening to these cats. And he discovers a big red hole in the ground that the cats are coming out of. And I realized, I haven't gotten that far in the story. I might change it because, as soon as I came up with that idea, I said, oh no, I've read a Murakami story. And, if somebody accused me of ripping off Kafka, I would say, oh yeah, absolutely, I'm ripping off Kafka. If somebody accused me of ripping off, I don't know, who else would I be okay with ripping off? There's plenty of people I'm okay with ripping off. Ionesco, I got Ionesco there. Oh yeah, absolutely. I'd be okay with ripping off somebody accusing me of ripping off Ionesco. Somebody said, that's an Ionesco ripoff. I would say, absolutely, that's an Ionesco ripoff. I don't really mind. Because I think, that's sort of the theme and variation happens with influence as well, especially early on when you're experimenting with a style. You take somebody else's style or you take somebody else's plotting and you work with that, and so you discover your own style that way. If 100% of my stories were Ionesco ripoffs, that might be a problem, but every once in a while, like I have a story that I might be over called The Bicycle Man, where it's accumulation, absurd accumulation. Absurd accumulation is a plot structure that really only Ionesco in it, and I don't know anybody else who does it. The way I went about formulating the story, the elements themselves are not ones that Ionesco has used. But that story structure is definitely an Ionesco story structure. So I don't mind, if somebody said, oh, you ripped off Ionesco. Well, ripping off, what's the difference between ripping off and being highly influenced by? Well, I have no interest in ripping off Murakami. That was a complete accident. The Pynchon, I sort of brought it on myself, just, as a fun way of playing around with the Pynchon formula. I'm not going to use the Pynchon prose, because Pynchon prose drives me crazy. I came to the realization at one point, this is sort of like how discovery of how stories work happens on an individual basis. People take these discoveries and universalize them. And when I made this discovery, I was tempted to universalize it. I read, early as a writer, I read, in college, I read just lots of Kurt Vonnegut and lots of Jack Kerouac. So I said Kurt Vonnegut uses really plain style because his plotting is so unusual, it's so disconnected. And then Kerouac uses a much more elaborate sort of prose because his plotting is very simple. So simple plotting, elaborate prose, simple prose, elaborate plotting. And then read Pynchon, elaborate prose, elaborate plotting. Plotting in a sense, but quirky elements, quirky prose. And it was too much. Just an entirely personal level, it was a bit too much. But anyway, I'm rambling, not unlike characters in a Pynchon novel. So I will wrap it up for today. Maybe I could get a cat to come over. Bo, come on. You want to say bye? I don't have the dogs right now. The dogs are in the doggy hotel. So I don't have constant animal presence in every single video. Oh well. Bo, from a distance, Bo says, see you on the next episode. Like, share, and subscribe.